Hello and welcome back to another update where we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one, we will cover the latest developments in Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Zaporizhzhia by the Robotyne area. We start out in the direction of Bakhmut, where we have seen that the Russian forces have managed to gain full control over the fortifications to the northwest of Klishchiivka. This puts Ukraine in a terrible position on the southern flank, as with the control over the fortifications here to the northwest of Klishchiivka, they now have a very strong position and control over the northwest of Klishchiivka with the fortifications under their control. This leaves them in a position where they can launch attacks in multiple directions from a strong base, both to the north to gain control over the forest line here, which will give them essentially full control over the fields in the nearby areas. It would allow the Russian forces to then pressure the Ukrainian forces in this whole area. Then the fortifications and the forest line here to the south of the fortification, this will leave them with control over this area right here, and then move on to the forest lines slash fortifications here to the southwest of Klishchiivka, which will then allow them to push on to the fortifications to the west of Klishchiivka. All of this without entering Klishchiivka itself. They can gain full control over the whole area and cut off the Ukrainian forces in the south, completely cutting them off from all supplies and connection with their forces here to the west of the canal. Although there are crossings, these are very tough to go through, as the Russian forces would just have focus on these areas all the time. And the reason why we're seeing a sudden increase in Russian assaults and subsequently advances here in the Klishchiivka area is that it was reported that the Russian forces have had their limit of artillery lifted in this part of the front line. This means that they have saved up enough artillery ammunition in this area to launch an offensive. Therefore, the limit has been released and they are allowed to shoot artillery at even a single person, as was reported. We also received reports that the Russian forces may have regained a foothold in Bogdanivka since the Wagner forces were forced to retreat from that area on the 11th of May this year, so 7 months ago. So with this, we see that there's rapid developments in the Bakhmut direction as the Russian forces continue their offensive operations. We then move on to the Avdiivka area, where here the Russian forces have managed to make an advancement here to the north of Stepove by the railways. With this, they're increasing their zone of control in this area as they try to reach the intersection here by the railways, which will allow them to have a strong flank here in the north. With this, they will have a coverage of forest lines and railways all throughout the north of Krasnohorivka towards the intersection and down to Stepove, which would allow them to have a strong front line. They're likely looking to advance further north as well, but that is for a later operation, as we see that they haven't really made that many advances here compared to in the direction of Avdiivka, because it seems that the most important part right now is Stepove, which is where we're seeing heavy fighting by both sides, even the Ukrainians counterattacking in this direction to try and slow down the Russian takeover of the village, which would subsequently allow the Russian forces to launch attacks on the coke plant. The Avdiivsky coke plant is a heavily fortified area, it's an industrial zone, and as such the Russian forces would have to expend a lot of forces trying to capture it. They would likely storm it in a similar manner to how they stormed the Bakhmut industrial zone here in the north of the city, and as such it'll take quite a while and they'll have to go under tunnels underneath, as it is also a mine area underneath the coke plant, and as such there's going to be a lot of fighting in the area. So with this, we see that the Russian forces will likely prepare for a long time, trying to gain all of the necessary territorial advances prior to storming the coke plant. But the importance of the coke plant matches the difficulty of getting it, as taking control of it for the Russian forces would mean a complete cut-off of supplies going in and out of Avdiivka. As for the southern flank of Avdiivka, we see here that the Russian forces managed to gain control over the quarry area, which was already difficult for the Ukrainian forces to defend due to the nature of the territory and geographical position. However, with this, the Russian forces are now in a direction where they have to gain control over the forest lines here in between the residential area of the southern outskirts of Avdiivka and the industrial zone which they recently captured. So with this, we are seeing that the Russian forces will either move northwards towards the residential area of Avdiivka or move across the rift that goes between the two residential areas here to the south of Avdiivka. The area is filled with trenches everywhere, to try and gain control over that prior to advancing north on direction. This would be to avoid the Ukrainian forces launching guerrilla warfare tactics, where they would try to cut off the Russian supplies going from their positions here in the back towards in the city of Avdiivka. And that is all for the Avdiivka part for this update. We then move on to the Robotyne direction, where here the Russian forces launch a counterattack here to the west of Robotyne, where they managed to regain lost positions of the trenches here to the west of Robotyne. And with this, they also managed to capture a Ukrainian German Leopard tank. As we see in this video here, it shows the Russian forces walking up to one of the Leopard tanks in one of the areas here that they recaptured here to the west of Robotyne. And with this, they have captured their first Leopard 2 tank. And as such, whoever captured it would get the bounty that the Ministry of Defense of Russia announced prior to the start of the Ukrainian offensive. Other than frontline developments, we also have other things to talk about, of which one of them is the fact that the Russian State Duma, the parliament in Russia, has adopted in the second reading a bill on volunteer formations as part of the Russian Guard. And as such, the Wagner forces have released a statement that they are waiting for the legalization of Wagner in the Russian Guard. So it is only a matter of time for Wagner to become an entity within the Russian Guard. As such, soldiers directly under the president of Russia. We also have a disruption of aid going to Ukraine, on top of the fact that there is a huge delay on all of the supplies getting sent to Ukraine from the west, with these two graphs representing exactly how that is. This first one shows how much aid has been reported, sent in a short term, and others which are pledged for the long term, commitments for the long term. And we see that since January 2023, this whole year of 2023, the majority of the aid has been pledges, commitments for multi-year aid rather than short-term aid. And on top of that, we see that since June of this year, so June, July, August, September, October, and November, that's 6 months, the Ukrainian forces have reached and received less than 5 billion euros of aid from the West. That is next to nothing compared to what they need, and this has been ever since the start of the offensive. This shows that the multi-year aid, the long-term commitments, are sent in preparation for a next offensive, but what is there here and now is next to nothing, which means that they're barely scraping by. And then we have this article here which shows how the Polish truckers' protest, which is blocking the different truckers from going in and out of Ukraine due to the Ukrainians having different working conditions than the Poles, which makes it detrimental to the Polish truckers, as well as in Slovakia and Hungary. As a result of this protest, where they block the border crossings between Ukraine and Poland, as well as Ukraine and Hungary and Ukraine and Slovakia, there is, at the borders between Poland and Ukraine, 2,950 trucks stranded, and the border on Slovakia, 650, and 750 on the border with Hungary. So with that, we have an approximate of 4,350 trucks that is failing to cross over to Ukraine with aid of any kind, whether it be military or other, and therefore the Ukrainians are facing a difficult situation due to this protest. So all in all, we can conclude that the situation is very, very difficult for the Ukrainian forces and Ukraine as a whole compared to Russia, and that the situation is developing further and further in Russia's favor. And with that, I conclude this video. Make sure to support me by checking out my Patreon and PayPal link down in the description. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.